Thanks for joining us, and welcome to our talk that we're doing on cognitive decline or canine cognitive dysfunction in dogs. The reason why I wanted to do this talk in August is because this is a time of year when actually cognitive issues start to get worse. Maybe not right in August, but by September, October, we start to see it happening more and more in people and animals. And as you're going to find out, there are some striking similarities between cognitive decline in animals and people. So it just seemed timely. And it also seemed appropriate to be doing this jointly with Laura Oliver of Lionel's Legacy, because she's got a heart of gold and she puts a lot of energy into looking after senior dogs. And of course, dogs with cognitive dysfunction are oftentimes senior. So the stars seem to sort of align for doing this talk, and I'm super glad that you could join us. This is a slide actually that Karen Becker put together independently, not for us, just on her own, but it was a nice little graphic. So I thought I would share it with you. She sort of has this mnemonic called DISHAL as the signs of canine cognitive dysfunction. D being disorientation, staring at walls or getting stuck in corners, or sometimes the dog will be used to the door opening, say, on the right-hand side, but then they start standing and looking at the left-hand side, things like that. That can be a sign of cognitive dysfunction. And then just how they interact changes. Sometimes dogs can get more aggressive, or they can be less interactive, be more distractible. So there's interaction changes. They may sleep less. Usually they will, we're used to older dogs sleeping, right, a lot, but oftentimes as dogs enter this phase of things, they start to be more restless in their sleep and pacing around a lot during the day when otherwise they would have been napping. So seeing this escalation in terms of their activity, which is also A, listed under A. They can have some incontinence, and it can be right after you let them out, and they can come in and just go ahead and have their accident right there. And then learning kind of linked to disorientation. They seem to forget things they've known their entire lives. So any one of these by themselves obviously does not signify cognitive dysfunction. But a lot of times when they occur together, then we're dealing with canine cognitive dysfunction syndrome. There's another phrase that has been used to describe this, what we're going to be talking about today, which is called Sundowner syndrome. Many of you are probably familiar with that if you're not familiar with DISHAL. What you may not know is that Sundowner syndrome is also a problem in people. And if we, in particular, those people with Alzheimer's or dementia. And what do we see but the same things we just listed? Pacing or wandering, having difficulty sleeping, feeling anxious or agitated or even angry. These are all traits that we have just listed off for dogs, and lo and behold, people have them too. So that's a big clue, right? It's a couple of clues. Number one, fortunately, it tells us that the things that work in people, if only we could find them, will probably work in dogs, and vice versa. The things that work in dogs will have every chance of working in humans. And it also maybe just kind of explains why we have so many frustrations surrounding Sundowner syndrome, because many of you have tried anxiolytic drugs to kind of stop the pacing and the whining and the agitation, and it just doesn't seem to touch them. And it's hard to understand. Your veterinarian doesn't really understand it. You use supplements that help with anxiety, and same thing. It just doesn't impact the situation. Well, look at the right-hand side of the slide there where we're talking about people. What are we saying? We're saying Alzheimer's as what is creating those symptoms. The reason that we struggle, kind of stealing my own thunder here, but the reason we struggle is because Sundowner syndrome in dogs is actually Alzheimer's disease. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Let's just kind of take a walk through the slides as sort of lay them out. This seems really appropriate, this case of Sundowner syndrome, because this is probably the very first dog that I treated that's in the Lionel's Legacy universe. He belonged to Susie Clayton, who's was with San Diego Humane Society at the time. I don't know if she's tuned in or not. And Bryan James was a good example of this Sundowner syndrome, or at least he was, but then it became an all-day syndrome. Those changes not just happening in the evenings, but happening all day. Oh, and let's just put a pin in an idea here for a second. Any effective treatment, first of all, that there's no effective treatments for Alzheimer's, right? And one of the reasons that we know or would not expect our drugs to be particularly effective is because from a Western point of view, no one can understand why is sundown such an issue. The paradigm, the context, the framework that can kind of answer that question for you. Why is it sundown when things start to go off the rails? Anybody who understands that and has a treatment for it, chances are it's going to work. So we're going to explain that for you. And in fact, the whole talk is going to be basically about Bryan James because he had his little journey and the different steps along his journey exemplify perfectly. He can teach us, everybody, to help their dogs because his case typifies all the cases of canine cognitive dysfunction that we're likely to stumble across. Maybe not everybody will need everything that Bryan James needed. And I'll mention a few stories along the way. But if we had a classic case, then basically Bryan James would be it. And so his story is probably very germane to yours. So as you might expect, he was restless, he was anxious, he was pacing. That's almost not even doing him justice in terms of that description. He wasn't just kind of idly restless and pacing at sundown. It turned into probably the most profound case of restlessness I've ever seen that had been going on for 4 to 5 years. Can you imagine living with a dog that is getting steadily worse in terms of their restlessness and pacing and agitation and weathering that for 4 to 5 years while you try to find a solution? That is dedication. And so hats off to Susie and hats off really to Lionel's legacy, for example, because this is Laura's life every single day. Is just this kind of taking on the world's worst scenarios and not resting until she finds a solution. Anyway, back to Bryan James, profoundly restless for 4 or 5 years. It had gone from sundown to 24/7. Literally, that's not a euphemism. 24 hours, 7 days a week, pacing, panting, getting stuck or lost in the corners, knocking things over. They'd long since given up sleeping in their own bedroom. Bryan James wasn't really sleeping upstairs anymore. He was kind of down somewhere safe for him, but that meant somebody needed to be with him. That's not to say he was feeble. Another thing that we would want to be able to explain if the paradigm we're using is accurate is why as quite an old dog, 15, I think, did he have seemingly superhuman strength during these episodes, which are going on all day? You don't expect that. You expect feeble wandering. You don't expect superhuman strength. So we need to, it's not just something to kind of note. We need to be able to explain it. If we can explain it, then chances are we're going to be able to treat it. Naturally, over 4 to 5 years, Susie had tried many different things, various supplements and drugs. We'll list the drugs in a second, but supplements included L-theanine, SAM-E. And, Susie and her husband had long since been unable to live a normal life with this going on. And again, kudos to them for toughing it out. What are the drugs that didn't work? As I mentioned when I stole my own thunder, drugs that we commonly reach for all that pacing and restlessness, we just assume it's going to work and they don't. Those are anxiolytic drugs, right? So he had been on Xanax and Selegiline, and which kind of alter neurotransmitters. So that's how they work. They basically alter your brain chemistry, hoping to take the edge off, promote feelings of wellness and happiness. So this neurotransmitter approach that we lean on for pretty much everything in the way of mental illness, just it wasn't touching him, or at least not appreciably. And then even sedatives weren't especially helpful. Trazodone, you're familiar with. A lot of dogs take trazodone. July 3rd. About the only thing that was working for Bryan James was acepromazine, and Susie said that she got maybe a couple hours of him being quiet for just a couple hours, and then away they go. So the drugs are not working because even though the dog looks anxious, it's not an anxiety issue. And sedatives kind of work because, sedatives don't alter your brain chemistry. They're sedatives. So they provided some relief. Nobody wants to sedate their dog all the time. What they want is they want some sort of a cure. So, okay, fair enough. We all want a cure. Exactly how are we supposed to achieve that? Well, what I do as a veterinarian, a holistic veterinarian, obviously I conventionally trained and know all the drugs and no surgery and stay up on all those things. But when I'm confronted with a problem that I don't have a drug or I don't have a surgery for, I have taken to looking at it from putting on basically a pair of Chinese medical glasses and looking at the situation through a completely just choosing a paradigm that another way of looking at the situation. And how do I know it's the right paradigm? Because as I said, the right paradigm is going to be the one that explains, can explain and predict. So the paradigm that I have found that explains what happens with sundowner dogs, why sundown, for example, is Chinese medical paradigm. It is one of my favorite paradigms because it is incredibly sophisticated and nuanced in its analyses. It's got an incredible array of plants and treatments to, kind of lean on. And these treatments are kind of closely tied to the rationale. So it's as an example, if you did iridology, which is a holistic discipline where you look at the iris and they say, oh, look at that, you've got issues in your ovaries and you've got issues in your stomach or whatever. At the end of all that, you don't actually, iridology doesn't tell you use this herb, use that herb, but Chinese medicine does. So it's a great system to turn towards when we don't understand a problem because it can explain all these different nuances and because it's got a treatment for everything that it has an explanation for. Okay. And you can tackle things on multiple fronts. So we don't just have to use herbs. They understood the importance of diet. That was in the world's oldest internal medicine textbook that was written in China about 2,000 years ago. I've read it. Page 1, chapter 1. It's actually a conversation between the Yellow Emperor and his court physician. And the first thing that's said in the book is the Yellow Emperor talking to his court physician and saying, "I've heard we used to live a lot longer, and now we don't. What's the issue? Like, why are we not doing as well?" And the physician, they could have been a physician from today, because what's his reply? His reply is, "Are you seeing the hours we work? Are you seeing how we eat? Like it's no wonder we're all sick." I kid you not, that was the explanation. So if nothing else, it tells you humans have not changed in 2,000 years. Anyway, all this to say that you're familiar with acupuncture, you're familiar with herbal medicine, but even dietary approaches and other physical medical techniques are part of the Chinese medical universe. And we can bring those things to bear on diseases as appropriate. Okay, so that's why we come at it from a Chinese medical point of view. And when we get something better, obviously we're happy, right? But we don't just leave conventional medicine behind. We do circle back to it. So when we have a success, then we say, we understand what the answer was. It's like watching Jeopardy, right? When you're watching Jeopardy, what are you supposed to do? You're the answer is the question. So what we understand after successfully treating a case is how were we, what question were we not asking? What are the wrong questions that we were asking? So before the Chinese medical analysis, it's like, why are these anxiolytic drugs not working? He's clearly anxious. But that's all we have to come at this with. After successfully treating him, we're going to be able to understand, oh, that's what's going on. And again, I've stolen my own thunder. What's going on is these dogs have Alzheimer's, not sort of like Alzheimer's. They do have Alzheimer's. That's one big reveal. The second big reveal is we can reverse it. So let's take a look and see what actually happened with Bryan James. I want to apply this new paradigm to him. I want to interpret him, all his signs and symptoms and his physical exam in this context. What context? Well, Chinese medicine always really boils down to something fairly simple. And so you see that diagram on the right, that's the yin yang, the Tai Chi symbol, as it's called. So that's supposed to be your body and my body and Bryan James' body. You have, in its simplest form, the body is understood in a Chinese medical model to have yang, which is the white half of the Tai Chi symbol. That's energy, that's heat. It's not physical, it's energy. It's something that's insubstantial, but motivating. It's dynamic. And then we do have to have a physical body, right? We have to have the substance of the body, the fluids of the body. So that's the other half, that's yin. So, and a living body has to have both. It has to have all these fluids and substances and physicality, and it needs to be animated. Uh, and you can imagine, or they imagine, that you needed these two forces, yin and yang, in approximately equal quantities, and they needed to be embraced. They need to kind of engage with each other permanently. Obviously, energy is just going to have a tendency to just leave, right? Up and out, the way heat rises. So we need to somehow yoke this yang energy and tie it to yin energy. When we do that, we create a third force. That third force is called qi. Basically, the body is steam powered. The interaction of heat with moisture to create steam, and as steam really is what qi is. In fact, the Chinese character for qi is a vapor cloud. Okay, so we get these things tied together. As long as they're tied together and yoked together in roughly equal quantities, really, there's no limit on your life. You could potentially live forever. And that's what early Chinese physicians were all about. Remember, from page 1, chapter 1, I heard we lived a lot longer and not now. That was his top concern, the Yellow Emperor. I want to be immortal. So the Chinese physicians always wanted to be immortal, and they were constantly looking for how to get there. So perfect place to look for answers when we're dealing with geriatric dogs. Okay, so fair enough. We're going to look at our symptoms of Bryan James in this light, and we're going to look at him physically. There's one more thing you need to know, though, to kind of fully make sense of Bryan James and other dogs and people that are experiencing Sundowner syndrome, is that, like I said, this yang energy is a resource, right? It's something that you're supposed to hang on to this stuff, hang on to your yin, hang on to your yang. You want to have it there as long as possible. So we don't want to squander it. Well, when is the time of day when you'd be most likely to accidentally lose heat, lose yang into your environment? And it's going to be the coolest, wettest hours of the day. The really the yinnest part of the day. Your yang energy will just be attracted to it. It'll just leave your body and go out into the night. So we don't want that to happen. So in our bodies, yang energy is supposed to internalize and actually be enfolded by yin energy and be held there really until morning. That's what sleep is. Sleep is this powering down, this internalization of yang energy. And then it's just like it's all dark, and it's like a big dark cloud around you, and you can just kind of, it's like putting on your little sleep masks or whatever, and saying goodnight. So that process of yang internalization is supposed to happen in the evening hours. If it doesn't, if yang energy stays like heat in our upper and outer body, including our heads, our brains, if it stays there, this dynamic force, and it's not supposed to be there, that's when we see symptoms. That's the explanation for Sundowner syndrome. Why is it sundown? That's the worst time. It's not just sundown, right? You know, as a situation progresses, it's like suddenly it's the whole night, right? This yang energy is supposed to be inside. When it's not, and it gets steadily worse, then there's a progressive tendency to be awake and restless and pacing and have this insomnia. Okay. There are physical things that can tell us that we're on the right track with this. And so one of those things is the pulse. When we feel the pulse on a person or on a dog, and particularly when we're feeling, like if you were to feel your own pulse, one of the first things that we look for when we're feeling the pulse is how quickly do you feel the maximum beat strength as you sort of push your finger in on your pulse? How soon? Do you kind of have to push in really deeply, a long ways, or you kind of feel that maximum impulse from your pulse right away? When you roll out of bed in the morning, you probably would guess that your pulse is deep, right? That you have to push a little deeper in order to find your pulse. There it is. Now, let's say you went out for your morning jog and then you come back. Where you're expecting your pulse now to be much more superficial, right? You just mobilized all this circulation. You just expended all this energy. You got things moving. That's going to be reflected in a pulse that's more superficial. That was Bryan James' pulse, even though, he hadn't just been out jogging 24/7. It's his pulse reflected the fact that this yang energy is just very superficial, upper and outer. And when I needled certain acupuncture points, I could feel instantaneously his pulse drop inwards. So we actually use acupuncture diagnostically to kind of tell us for sure what's going on. There's an acupuncture point kind of, if you feel the back of your skull, the occiput, you kind of drop down off your skull to this little divot on either side. This big divot, it's probably about that big on you. That is a place called gallbladder 20, GB20. Dogs have that too. It's right below their atlas bone. When you press on that or massage that divot, that is a point to kind of push yang energy into the interior. So I just did that with an acupuncture needle, and I felt his pulse reflect that internalization of yang energy right away. And I knew that that was his main problem at that moment, was his yang energy was just staying out. It wasn't being internalized, and that's what we had to do. There are other acupuncture points close by there. Anmian, in the picture there, means heavenly sleep. So it's very close to gallbladder 20, which is all about this internalization of yang. So you can see how the two of them are very similar. So if you have a dog like this, you can massage that acupuncture point. Tonight, whatever, 6, 7 o'clock, they start to get agitated. Then you can just go ahead and massage them for 5 minutes, just as they're standing there, or if they'll briefly sit, and you can start to work on those points, and you can start to kind of coax them into just being a bit more sedated. Karin and I, we rescue dogs just like Laura, nowhere near the scale, but we have 2 Weimaraners, and one of them, well, both of them, let's face it, are absolutely crazy. But the first one had severe anxiety when we first got him. And it was during COVID. So I was home when I wasn't helping out Laura with her dogs. So I would do acupressure on him like, 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day, just, for a few minutes at a time, emphasizing that gallbladder 20 to try to get him to kind of calm down. And it worked. It worked along with herbs, which we're going to share with you. And it worked with exercise, et cetera, et cetera. But it is effective. So remember that as a little trick if you have a dog that's like this. Okay. So actually, Bryan James actually visibly got drowsy even during his first little acupuncture treatment. And I thought, well, that is a good sign, and a sign that maybe he's going to go home and do better. So how do you know that this is what's going on with your dog? Here's some of those common yang rising symptoms: the pacing, the restlessness, the agitation, barking, vocalizing. Worse in the evening, we've talked about that. Being distractible, just not able to focus. Their mind is just like everywhere. And this sometimes weird superhuman strength, even in an aging patient, animal or human. Here's what we call a pathognomonic symptom, meaning that whenever you see this symptom, you know that this is the problem. I mean, there are different reasons why a dog would pace or bark, but when a dog will only drink ice cold water, or will ignore water and eat snow and ice and just consume that stuff as much as possible, or if they're a geriatric and it's winter and they go and they get up in the middle of the night and they just go and stick their head in a snowbank, you know that their head is on fire, that they just have way too much yang energy in their mind, and they're literally trying to just basically ice themselves down to kind of get rid of it. So I know that some of you out there will have encountered that symptom, and now you know what's behind it. Obviously, if they're thirsty, then they're gonna have the urinary frequency to kind of go with it, or dilute urine oftentimes. They may have a red tongue or a darkish red tongue. If you're taking a look, maybe you're going to feel their pulse. I don't know if you feel like feeling their pulse, but if you do, it probably will feel very superficial, as in we feel the pulse in a dog on their inner thigh, and just the lightest amount of pressure, and you feel the maximum beat strength. Checking with just one finger will tell you that, okay, their yang is on their surface. And the insomnia, as I said. And they're not going to have all these symptoms. They're not going to have all 10, but they might have 2 or 3 or 4. And if they do, this is what's going on. So the treatment for this, we confirmed what was going on in Bryan James with acupuncture, but even if we didn't have that confirmation, I would still be reaching for this. This also is a 2,000-year-old formula listed in a 2,000-year-old book. And this formula is designed to internalize yang energy, to take it out of the head, to take it out of the periphery of the body, and put it back into the body interior, where it can engage with yin and be yoked there and held there, and not drifting out to the surface all the time. The internalization comes from the fossilized bone and oyster shell. And in the old days, of course, China didn't realize what these fossilized bones were, and they thought, oh, these must be dragon bones. But of course, they're not dragon bones, but they are things like mammoth bones, etc. So there's Chinese medicine has long used fossilized bone as which of course now is there's no bone left in it, it's just mineral, but used these minerals medicinally. It also uses shells medicinally, oyster shell. And these two things are a big part of, they have a calming influence. They don't deplete your yang energy, but they just sink it internally. If you have probably used minerals like calcium to help yourself, the warm glass of milk before bed. Minerals help us sleep. Some people take magnesium and calcium before bed. Same concept. They're trying to help internalize their yang energy and facilitate this powering down. Now, the plants have flavors, and flavors tell you what things do. So, skullcap or Scutellaria in that formula tastes bitter, and we use skullcap in Western herbal medicine for its calming influences and even as an anti-seizure herb. And if you went to a place like Whole Foods and you looked in their herbal medicine section under plants for sleep, you would find skullcap to be part of those herbal formulas. So many herbal cultures around the world, even though they're separated by thousands of years, all cottoned on to the same uses for the same plants. And they use taste to get there. How does something taste? That tells you what it does. Another thing that tastes bitter in the herbal formula is rhubarb root. So the idea was that Scutellaria would have an affinity, particularly for the head, kind of cooling it off. Instead of sticking your head in a snowbank, you take Scutellaria instead. And then we have rhubarb. Rhubarb was considered to take that yang energy and direct it internally into the digestive tract, because that's really where you want to use yang energy a lot of the time. Yes, absolutely. Sometimes you want to just have the lights on and be engaged and awake and alert. But there are times when you want to take that heat and power your digestion with it. So rhubarb basically takes that yang energy and internalizes it to where it can power digestion. Ginseng is in there because ginseng is a chi tonic. And if you have this yang energy always on the surface and yin always inside, and the two are not engaged anymore, they become chi deficient. So they put ginseng in there, Korean ginseng, as the world's only source chi tonic. This very fundamental type of chi that is generated when yin and yang interact with each other. From a Western point of view, ginseng is an anxiolytic. So it helps to reduce stress. It helps to reduce the constant discharge of the adrenal glands, constant discharge of adrenaline and cortisol that leads to the pacing and the agitation and the restlessness and the overreactivity. So that's the structure of the formula. And you're looking at it and you go, oh, it sounds great, Steve, except it sounds like it's an anxiolytic formula, just like you were talking about before. And you said this is not an anxiety issue. So why should it work? Well, let's just see if it does first, and then we'll revisit why it's working. So the acupuncture, as we could kind of tell from when he sort of dozed off when we gave him his first treatment, I knew he was probably going to have a good day or two. And he did. He slept through that night, which was you got to appreciate the momentousness of that. That was the first time in several years that he had slept through the night. So that's the power of those acupressure and acupuncture points. So if you have a dog like this, get busy. He was much more mellow for the next 48 hours, but then, he's a pretty extreme case. And so acupuncture wears off more quickly in extreme situations. But still, 4 days out, he's still not as bad as he was. And by that time, the herbs are starting to kick in. So he had kind of briefly worsened a little bit. And now, once again, he's kind of sleeping through the night. He might have restlessness in the morning, but then he'll settle down to sleep. He still has his Sundowner time of restlessness. So he's not just consistently on like the Energizer Bunny. He's kind of got some periods where he's actually getting some rest. So we're definitely on the right track. So how are these herbs working? What is going on? Well, again, I stole my own thunder and tipped my own hand by saying that the reason those formulas work, that formula, is not just because it treats anxiety and mania was what it was invented to treat. It doesn't just treat that. It treats Alzheimer's disease. So Bupleurum, dragon bone, and oyster shell combination, yes, it reduces anxiety. If it was an anxiety situation, no, the drugs would have worked. So it's this action against Alzheimer's that is what makes the formula have a meaningful impact when the Xanax did not. So there are approximately 4 major pathways in the human brain through which Alzheimer's changes develop. And in dogs, only one of those is really markedly operative. Now, that being said, the formula treats more than one of those. It treats two or three of those pathways. But within Bryan James' dog, the formula is probably acting in one very specific way in order to improve his mentation. And that's great, because if we can find other things that work in that same way, we can bring them to bear as well and get a more rounded effect. We don't have to just rely on one herbal formula or one herb. We can bring other things to bear. So this is closing the circle. Once we understand how something works, then we can figure out what's really going on from a Western point of view. And then once we find that out, okay, what other things should work? It opens up a world of possibilities for us. Interestingly, veterinarians don't get taught this about canine cognitive dysfunction in dogs. As a rule, vets only learn physiological mechanisms that they have drugs to treat. So if you have not heard of canine cognitive dysfunction being similar to Alzheimer's, that's not surprising, because we don't have drugs to treat Alzheimer's. And so vets look at that as a human disorder, but we now know that it's equally alive and well in dogs. So what exactly of those four things is wrong inside the canine brain? It's a deposition of something called amyloid beta deposits. And they accrue with age in the canine brain, just like they do in many people. And there's a part of your brain, roughly here, that if the amyloid accumulates in there, then it interferes with an animal's or person's ability to reason, to think, to listen, to kind of be taught, and to kind of rationalize their way out of a situation or whatever thoughts are plaguing them. So that's where this amyloid deposits are especially problematic. So here's what we're talking about when we talk about these amyloid deposits. So in figure A there, you see normal neurons, and normal neurons in your brain, they kind of interlace. So they're not shown in that diagram to be interlacing, but those little things that those dendrites, they're called, they extend off neurons and they interlace with each other like branches of trees in a forest. So, and this is how messages get passed from one neuron to another. You can imagine if there is something in a way such that those branches were not communicating, then suddenly we're having whole neural pathways that are not working, such as the neural pathways that would be involved with reasoning and thinking. So what is particularly getting in the way are amyloid plaques. So that's in figure B there. You see the kind of the brownie looking yucky stuff. That's accumulations of amyloid. Now in a human Alzheimer's brain, those plaques, those islands of amyloid, and amyloid is kind of rubbery, but those islands of rubbery proteins, they are quite dense. In dogs, they're not as dense. So maybe that gives us a bit of an edge in terms of trying to reverse the symptoms, if we can find things that do reverse the symptoms, which we have. Also, the protein, well, I'll show you it on the next slide. For now, just take note of these plaques and understand that they can get in the way of the trees of the forest communicating with each other, because now there's a big amyloid plaque that's kind of in the way. The next slide shows one other way that we can interfere with communication. And that is, well, you might wonder, why on God's green earth, why do we even have that as a feature? Is it a bug and not a feature, to use a software metaphor? It's actually a feature. This amyloid comes from something that is useful. We've called it amyloid precursor protein only because we know that when things go wrong, that's where the amyloid comes from. But this APP, as it's called, in a left-hand part of that diagram, the kind of the pale blue section of the diagram, you can see this APP is a protein peppering the outside of neurons. So when these branches interlace and communication happens between them, oftentimes there are compounds drifting back and forth between the edges of the trees. And these compounds will go from one end of one branch and it'll kind of glom onto the next branch. Those proteins are involved in those kind of sending out and receiving of these little molecules that facilitate communication. So that's what the APP protein does when all is well. Everything in nature breaks down. And when the APP protein is breaking down properly, we don't have this formation of amyloid when this cleavage that is associated with that protein breaking down happens. If the cleavage is happening in the right place, you just have the breaking into pieces and gets consumed and destroyed, and there's no problem. But if we have a pathological situation, then as those proteins are broken down, there you can see in the right-hand part of that diagram, there's a chunk that gets released intact, and that is becomes something called amyloid. It starts to polymerize essentially and form this rubbery compound that then gets in the way. So not only do we not have the ability to kind of receive these little chemicals on our neuron membranes anymore, but we have rubber in between the two things that are trying to send messages to each other. So it's a bit of a double whammy. So what causes that abnormal breakdown? Well, one of the things that causes it is inflammation, so-called proteases. Proteases, things that degrade protein, are part of the inflammatory compound, a big part. And so when there's a lot of inflammation in the brain, then we have this accelerated creation of amyloid. So when they looked at dogs to find out, do they have inflammation in their brains? Surprisingly, they didn't really, or not to the extent that Alzheimer's patients have it in humans. However, Bupleurum, which turns out to be the major player in that formula that we use for Bryan James, Bupleurum, the first plant that's listed, is a powerful nervous system anti-inflammatory. And as it turns out, it has a big role to play in terms of interfering with this production of this rubbery substance that is interfering with reasoning power. So why don't we have a drug? I mean, it's clear. We understand what's going on, right? Probably we understand it much more than anyone ever imagined we could understand Alzheimer's. It's because in Western medicine, we're always trying to target one cell receptor, one thing with one chemical compound. We kind of cling to this idea that because that's how we discover things in science, that's how we should treat patients. We conduct studies and we control variables and we do one thing at a time. We try one compound at a time. We see what happens. Oh, look, it created this particular effect that we can measure. So then we make the logical leap of, if this is how we discover, or this is the way we discover a drug works, that's how we should use the drugs, one at a time. That's not how nature works, though. You look at your average plant. Your average plant has hundreds of different compounds inside it, and maybe about 30 or 40, 10% or more, that are actually very active in doing stuff. And it doesn't have tons of just those 30 or 40. It just has little bits of those 30 or 40, and they work together. So science has not been able to find one chemical compound that binds to one thing, and you just take it, and all your Alzheimer's symptoms go away. But it has found plants containing dozens and dozens of compounds that, when you give them all together, we see the Alzheimer's pathways being disrupted. So medicinal herbs have been researched heavily for the treatment of Alzheimer's. They're trying to get the individual little drug because that's what you can patent, right? That's how drug companies make their billions, is by finding the one thing that works to unravel an entire disease process. But it's a bit of a fantasy. That is not how your body works. And that's not how Alzheimer's is going to be effectively treated. You need dozens of compounds acting simultaneously in order to undo this pathology. The good news is there's no shortage of plants that have been found to be helpful in the unraveling of these Alzheimer's pathways. And we're going to dig into a few of those right now. But as you can see in the slide there, the plants work because they're targeting lots of different things simultaneously. Alzheimer's is basically, as a disease, is suffering like a death from 1,000 cuts instead of just one thing that blows it out of the water. That's how the plants are working. Okay, so the big player, as we mentioned in that first plant, or first formula, is Bupleurum. So one of the things it does is it interferes with those proteases, those enzymes that break down proteins, which we know that's where we get the rubber. That's where we get the amyloid. It's because we're breaking down those proteins and we're doing it wrong, and we're creating amyloid in the process. So one of the enzymes, proteases in the body, is matrix metalloproteinase. And it's a big, big proteinase in the brain. And Bupleurum inhibits that. Specifically, there's one compound, maybe more than the others in Bupleurum, that does a lot of the heavy lifting. Seikosaponin C, SSC for short, is a very active component of this Bupleurum root. and that inhibits this amyloid beta production, probably partly through the inhibiting proteinases. But as we said, that's not a big deal in dogs. So it is also working another way. It's working by just suppressing the formation of these APPs that are going to become amyloid if we keep doing things wrong. So there are other compounds in that formula that do roughly the same thing, but Bupleurum does it markedly so. But here's a plant, well, not really a plant, it's a fungus, that you may have heard of recently. It's been kind of very topical in holistic dog circles called lion's mane. Lion's mane has been researched for its what it brings to bear in this kind of situation. Because if you think about it, okay, fair enough, we're using plants to help stop this formation of this rubber inside the head. But how to get rid of what's actually there now? How to clean up the mess? How do you actually take away the amyloid so that these trees in the forest can once again find each other? We need that as well. Turns out that the formulas that we're using do that, but here is another one that you've probably heard a lot about called lion's mane. There's an enzyme that degrades this amyloid, and it's called insulin degrading enzyme. So you know it degrades insulin. You may have even heard of Alzheimer's described as the diabetes of the brain because of the role of insulin in driving Alzheimer's. By degrading insulin, we can help to antidote Alzheimer's. But we don't just promote this insulin. Well, it doesn't just degrade insulin, it degrades amyloid, this IDE enzyme. And lion's mane stimulates the production of that enzyme. So if you've got a dog that is experiencing this Sundowner syndrome, go out and get some lion's mane. The beauty of mushroom extracts is they're gentle. They're somewhat neutral in a lot of different medically important ways that, to my mind, as a practitioner, they tell me I can't really rely on them. I can't rely on a mushroom extract to save a life. But that kind of neutrality about them also makes them, on the other hand, extremely safe to use in almost a whole bunch of situations. The worst that can happen is nothing happens, right? Which is what you're used to for your supplements and that you slop in your animal's food. Like many times you don't even know if it's doing anything, but at least it's not going to do any harm. Lion's mane as a mushroom, rarely is it going to do any harm, but good research to suggest that in a sundowner situation or an Alzheimer's situation, it will start to break down those plaques. Keep that in mind, as lion's mane was not a thing back when we were treating Bryan James, but knowing what I know now, I would probably have gone ahead and put him on that lion's mane. So when we last left Bryan James, he was responding. Susie had already started to kind of wean him off the Xanax after just the first week. We're going to return to him in a second. But meanwhile, we know this model of yin and yang rising, and it's not internalizing when it's supposed to. We know that model is actually a pretty decent description of what's happening. So what else can we get out of this model that might help us? What does this model suggest might also work? It suggested internalizing yang should help, and it did. So what do we do with yang energy once we get it there? Well, we now know that you need lots of yin energy to kind of enfold itself around the yang and keep it inside, to smother it essentially, at least for a while. So it suggests that we should use yin tonics as well as yang internalizers for dogs and people experiencing Sundowner syndrome. So we rolled that into Bryan James' protocol pretty early on. And a formula that I use is one that you've probably heard me mention if you're a member of Ask Dr. Steve, or visit that Facebook group and read the thousands of posts that are there. You will see Glennia and Romania, a herbal formula, commonly mentioned. It works extremely well with these Bupleurum-based formulas in order to provide that yin half of the equation. So we introduced that to Bryan James. Who's the heavy player, the heavy hitter, the big player in this Glennia and Romania? Well, it's the Romania. So Romania is essentially Chinese foxglove in North America. Different species, though. Foxglove in North America, very toxic. Chinese foxglove, very nourishing, very supportive. Most of you will have heard of Romania, the root of that plant, as being extremely helpful in kidney failure, and that is true. You can see we use the root, which is a really thick, dark, sweet tasting root. You just know if it's 1,000 years ago and you're rooting around and you dig up that root and you take a bite of it, you just know it's going to be something nourishing because it's just so substantial and sweet and yummy. And Chinese medicine actually made it yummier. They would stir fry it in wine, and then it becomes prepared Romania root. We don't need to stir fry our dog's Romania in wine. We can just use the fresh version. So fresh Romania is a big part of why this formula would be expected to help. Why would it be expected to help? Because it's one of the few plants in the world that contains a chemical compound called catalpol. And catalpol, guess what? It, through another mechanism, helps to reduce these senile plaques, these amyloid beta plaques in the cerebral cortex, especially this prefrontal cortex where all of our reasoning takes place. And so, not surprisingly, in studies of Romania and catalpol, once again, learning and memory were noticed to improve when the extract was being used to treat Alzheimer's patients. So again, we're trying to kill off Alzheimer's through the death by 1,000 cuts. More power to us. If we can find other plants that now we know what's actually working and why, we can, as we said, when we close the loop and explain our successes and we understand why we're getting those successes, now we can start to go out in the world and grab other things and bring them in. Lion's mane, if we knew about it at the time, Romania, because we did know about it at the time, bring those forces to bear and see how good can we get Bryan James. Now you might be thinking, I got this dog and I really want to source this for myself. I want to give it a try. I know that Bryan James is going to do well because there's no way you talk about Bryan James if he didn't do well. So where do I get this stuff? Well, the beauty of it is that because of Bryan James, we took the two formulas that worked for him and we put them in one bottle. And the bottle is called Halscion. It's a gold standard herbs product. Laura was kind enough to let us spend years working with her on her animals, going through her facility to develop these formulas that for senior dog rescues to be able to use on their own to help cut their vet bills. And Laura was very instrumental in helping to bring these things to market. And of course, once we realized, they're working for Laura, they will probably work for others. That's essentially how Gold Standard was created. So the Halcyon is available to you now. Okay, so Halcyon contains the Bupleurum, dragon bone, and oyster shell combination, and it contains the Glenia and Romania combination. And so we have a strong effect on inhibiting amyloid plaque deposition and improving canine cognitive dysfunction situations. Romania also has a very nourishing effect on the prefrontal cortex. It helps to make sure the blood supply to this part of the brain is excellent because blood supply in neurology is very closely tied to how much activity can the brain be capable of. You need a decent blood supply in order in this region for the brain to be able to function properly, those reasoning centers be able to function properly. So we put Bryan James on that formula as well. And Susie had already started weaning off the Xanax, the L-theanine, and the SAM-E. So at week 1, remember this has been a 4 to 5 year problem. So when the body gets what it wants, it works very quickly, even for very entrenched chronic pathology. So by week 1, Bryan was now having 3 to 4 episodes of restlessness in the 12 hours after sundown, as opposed to 24/7 episodes of restlessness. Now they're much shorter, they're more manageable. He's less agitated. They're considerably milder. And you can imagine the stress level in his owners is much lower as well. Now, of course, he's losing his Hulk strength because where was that coming from? It's coming from his yang energy being out here, animating his musculature as well as his brain. As we internalize his yang and bring it home, we're going to see that some of that Hulk strength goes away. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. By month 2, Bryan James was off all his drugs. And to quote Susie, Bryan has been doing amazingly well. He is relaxed and comfortable most of the time. He even slept in the car today after hiking with his dad. So yay for Bryan. Did that just continue indefinitely? No, things change. And so he was, a year later, he started to have some problems. They weren't exactly the same though. But if you think back to Karen Becker's Dish All poster, you can see that the kinds of things he was experiencing were still part of that canine cognitive dysfunction. It's just that kind of crazy Hulk energy and that crazy relentless pacing, that's not how it's manifesting anymore. But he still has the canine cognitive dysfunction tendencies, but now we need to do something different because Halcyon is not covering those bases. These symptoms have developed in spite of the fact that he was using the two herbs that constitute Halcyon. So what does he look like now? He's got urinary incontinence. Sometimes he'll kind of stop and pee if he's outside. He'll think he's done, but he's not, and he'll just kind of dribble as he walks. More worrisome is when he also stands and looks at the owner as he's urinating in the house. Yeah, but that's okay. Not only did it take Susie by surprise, it took him by surprise as well. This is really the big problem right now, is this urinary incontinence, which, you may have been kind of feeling demoralized if your dog has this Sundowner syndrome, thinking, how do I stop this? The drugs don't work. Urinary incontinence is another thing that leaves us feeling frustrated and demoralized. It's another kind of unlivable symptom. But fortunately, we can address that. And particularly when it happens, even when a dog is on Halcyon, we know exactly what to do for it. Other sort of cognitive things we want to see fixed, though, we occasionally get lost in the entryway of the house. He's in a new house now, seemed to learn his way around it reasonably quickly, but still he kind of gets lost in portions of it. Now, at least, he's not just this Energizer bunny anymore. Now he's at least getting his sleep, but he is a bit more clumsy and stumbly. Now you almost feel like, God, we almost want to kind of just rev him up a little bit, right? If that was your sense of things, then you're absolutely right. That's what we need now. We have done a lot to take the edge off him. And now what we're left with is the fatigue. Do you remember back when you were in college or university and you had all these exams and you're just like pedal to the metal? You're studying all night, you're working super hard, you get through your exams, you go home to your folks' place, and then what happens? You crash and you get sick. It's a similar type of situation where we actually, for Bryan James to have kept up that level of Energizer bunniness, his adrenal glands, the level of stress that they were perceiving and responded to was enormous. When we look at some of the other scientific studies for that Bupleurum formula and what does it treat in humans, one of the big things that's noticed is that it really calms down this excess adrenal secretions. So it takes adrenal glands that are in overdrive and just calms them way down. In humans, of course, that can be experienced as calmness. It also lowers their blood pressure, stress-induced blood pressure. Bryan James had a year of taking this stuff and calming down his excess adrenal gland secretions. So that's finally started happening. Now what we're finding is that there's no gas in the tank. We've taken our foot off the gas pedal. Great. Except now the gas tank's empty. So the next thing we need to do is buck him up and put some gas in his tank to actually help him synthesize some more of these hormones that he has depleted. So we call this adrenal fatigue. Again, it's not something that veterinarians are commonly taught about. They're taught about Addison's disease, a complete absence of adrenal hormones, but it's only recently that veterinarians have started to get instruction from ClinPath labs about, okay, well, they're not full on Addisonian, but there's some evidence of adrenal fatigue there. So that was what was going on with Bryan James. I didn't need to do blood tests on him, but if you do blood tests on this situation, one of the things you find is that, and this is commonly missed, one of the things you find is that the sodium-potassium ratios in your dog's blood work are too low. So a dog does not have adrenal fatigue when there's sodium, when you take the sodium number and the potassium number and you divide the sodium by the potassium, it should come out to about 30, certainly 27. So just haul out your dog's previous blood work, take the sodium number, divide that by the potassium number. If it comes to over 27, your dog doesn't have adrenal fatigue. But a lot of these dogs, their sodium potassium ratio is down around 23 or 24, 22 or lower. When that happens, you know that this is what's wrong with your dog and is what's driving the symptoms that you're seeing. And it's not always reported on the blood tests. And if it's not reported, then it's commonly missed by veterinarians. They don't do the math themselves. So you as a pet owner can go ahead and just crunch those numbers and make sure that there's no evidence of adrenal fatigue. But if you're down at 23 or 24 and your dog is tired or fatigued or has urinary incontinence or is just kind of dragging themselves around or is just not as sharp as they were, this is what the issue is. And the next thing we're going to talk about is going to help your dog dramatically. As you might imagine, though, the other time you see this is in a dog with Cushing's. Sometimes it'll be after you've gotten rid of the Cushing's. after you've gotten rid of that adrenal hormone excess secretion situation. And then you find out there's no gas in the tank. Sometimes it's happening even while the dog has Cushing's, and you have to treat both. You have to quell this excessive secretion of adrenal glands, and you have to put more gas in the tank. You have to replenish those adrenal glands at the same time. That happens pretty commonly. And again, something you will need to kind of figure out for yourself, because your veterinarian will not be looking for adrenal fatigue in a dog with Cushing's. They're just going to be thinking Cushing's, too many hormones, too many hormones, too many hormones. They're not going to be thinking that the dog actually doesn't have enough, because they don't learn about this in their training. So, but that doesn't mean you can't be aware of it. So, and the Halcyon, that got rid of all these excessive adrenal hormones in Bryan James, you might have thought, could you use that for Cushing's? Yes, you absolutely could. The first thing we do for Cushing's is we change the diet to a real food diet. That's the first and most important thing you need to do to treat Cushing's. If that plus a herbal formula called Four Marvels doesn't take care of it, then Halcyon is the next thing to try. Keep the real food diet in place, but you add the Halcyon in. And a lot of those dogs improve substantially when they get Halcyon instead. Okay, that's a lot to digest on the one slide, but this is kind of what's going on with Bryan James, and the treatment for it is something that, again, if you're an Ask Dr. Steve member, you've probably heard a lot about. A company called Con Essentials sells it as something called Lift the Qi. Chinese medicine, the translation of the formula name is Boost the Qi. It's got a ton of ginseng in it as a qi tonic replenisher, if you will, of the adrenal glands. The Chinese name is Bu Zhong Yi Qi Tong, tonify the center and lift the qi or boost the qi combination. That's how you translate that. Recently, as in just a month or two ago, Gold Standard started selling this as Galvanex. And so now you can buy it from the Gold Standard site. So this is a very tonifying formula, a very lifting formula. If you think about it, what was Halcyon doing? Halcyon was descending and internalizing. And what is this formula doing? It's lifting. And so if you remember that Tai Chi symbol, we want to kind of lift that black half and replenish the black half of the Tai Chi symbol. At the same time, we descend the white half and have the two of them integrated. When we take care of both things at the same time, you end up with this really well-balanced protocol for dealing with canine cognitive dysfunction and anxiety and a lot of canine mentation issues. In the case of urinary incontinence, we're literally making the animal more aware of their bladders and what's going on. So we're kind of raising their level of their cognition to where I have to urinate and I should go outside to do that. We're literally improving this prefrontal cortex, giving it some nourishment, giving it some support, giving it some energy, giving it some blood flow so it can do a better job of engaging with its bladder, becoming aware of its bladder. That's what the new product from Gold Standard looks like. In the case of Bryan James, he got the Bu Zhong Yi Qi Tong, but it's the same thing. Within 2 weeks, just 2 weeks, he had gone 3 nights without accidents. So basically within 11 days, they were starting to see an improvement. Still would happen a few during the day, but the situation was much more manageable because you're home and you can let your dog out when you see an accident about to happen. Within 6 weeks, the urinary incontinence was rare to non-existent. So Bryan James is not an exceptional dog. He is what we expect. If you have a dog with classic Sundowner syndrome and these classic symptoms, they should respond just as readily as he did. When we institute this Galvanex, are we no longer treating Alzheimer's? Like, how's it working? Because really those were cognitive dysfunction symptoms, and we know cognitive dysfunction is Alzheimer's. So does Galvanex treat Alzheimer's? Indeed, it does. So the formula has been researched precisely for that. And once again, this very meaningful pathway in animals of this amyloid beta accumulation is once again impacted through several different mechanisms, not just one. You cannot treat Alzheimer's by focusing on just one thing. And as with the Romania, they saw significant improvements in cognition, not just stopping the amyloid, but actually being able to think and being able to reason, seeing those powers returning. So it's considered in human research that's being done to be a great utility for the treatment of dementia and especially Alzheimer's disease. So wrapping it up, three things that you can now do for your Sundowner dog. The lion's mane and a Halcyon probably to begin with, and expect to come in there later with the Galvanex. Or if you're going to use them, then instituting them all at the same time. But those three things together, powerful tools to undo these Alzheimer changes in a dog's brain and improve their cognitive function. And then as long as you keep using them, you keep inhibiting that disease process. So that is why, even though these herbs are also anxiolytic, that's why they succeed where anxiolytic drugs fail, because Xanax, selegiline, they do nothing for these Alzheimer types of changes. How are these herbs treating anxiety? Because anxiety is a feature of Alzheimer's. How are they pulling that off? Again, it's by, number one, making sure the adrenal glands are not just like blasting all their hormones out into the dog's body. And number two, once we've stopped the blasting, to kind of look and go, wow, there's not a lot of gas in your tank. We need to go ahead and replenish your hormones. And then using the Galvanex in order to do that. So that is what I had to say about cognitive dysfunction. If you want to give this a try, I don't have a lion's mane brand to steer you towards, but there's no lack of it out there in the internet.